For this episode of Open Studios, we're visiting with Leigh and Lester to talk about her upcoming exhibition, Flexible Foundation. How did your experiences in Berlin influence your upcoming exhibition?
By getting to go unfettered to Berlin, to the residency, I was able to really pursue a lot of ideas that I had been mulling over and thinking about. And you're in a position where you're having to make art and do your life. And so it gave me really, really concentrated studio time. Being able to go to Berlin for the amount of time that Blue Star gave me allowed me to pursue some ideas that I had been thinking about for a long time and didn't really have the time to focus on and resolve it. And so being there without any responsibilities other than the ones that you put on yourself, that you have this unfettered focus of studio time, and you have an amazing city that can inspire that. It made a huge difference in being able to resolve some of the ideas that I had had. And also, before I went to Berlin, I ended up doing research on the rubble mountains there in Berlin, and one of which is Clement Mountain. Clement is an old bunker that was so indestructible that they tried to blow it up, and it just sort of split it in half, and they finally figured out that they would just have it be a receptacle for all of the destruction and rubble for the city. So they've done that, but now it's this beautiful park that it's this little bucolic natural setting. In my work, I work with layering, and so you have the historic elements of the rubble mountains being the destruction of war, the destruction of these buildings, the remnants of these buildings piled up, and then layered on top another history is being formed where it's just been completely enveloped and taken over by nature. So the layering, I've found a real kind of understanding or appreciation for that in relation to my work. In Berlin, and that sort of layering of history and information and nature sort of reclaiming whatever was there before. So I have the imagery of the certain site-specific locations or objects that I found on those rubble mountains. But I wanted to, instead of doing a straightforward rendering of the objects, I ended up doing blind contours of them.
Will you talk about the trajectory of your work and some changes you've noticed since your residency?
So having, again, that unfettered time to really focus on the work allowed you to just be in a weird way, not be efficient about your time, but you could just end up really enjoying making mistakes. And that's half the fun of art, but sometimes when you have deadlines, you don't end up having the luxury of making enough mistakes that can really move the work forward. So the idea of being able to just play and do it and then just be like, I'll toss it in the trash if I don't like it. But in being there, I ended up putting a lot of other bits of information, the in-between information, negative space has found its way into my work a little bit more as a substantial mark made within the work. So it's kind of a wreck right now, but this is where I do the drawings. This is where I do the cuttings of the drafting film. I also draw on the drafting film. This piece was done in Berlin. It is a third generation of the Genesis plant that was at an exhibit at Southwest School of Arts and Crafts, and then next generation was at Art Pace, and this is now the third generation. So it'll keep going and getting further and further removed from it. What I've done here is then taken some of the drawings that I've done, mentioning the research about the history of the botanicals, but also the propagation, environmental, geographical information, putting together the most disparate type plants because you can in genetic modification. So those are the drawings that I've done, which I then put through a program that distills the color drawings of them into these cells. But I end up putting the color cells on and then cutting out the information of wherever the cell finds itself. So there's an accentuation. Now, once the original was just a solid color cell with distilled information, and now placing them on top of these cut out pieces, it ends up letting the plant information from the original drawing, but not really, because it's once again layered with all this information.
Will you discuss your research process and some of your conceptual influences?
So in doing the historical layering of my drawings, I end up doing a lot of research into what was happening scientifically at that time, what was happening, accepted scientific knowledge, accepted botanical knowledge, but there's also kind of this intriguing intersection of commerce with plants as well. But then you throw in sort of the current scientific capability of genetically modifying plants to our own needs or desires, and you end up having the presumptuousness that it may or may not affect the greater sort of house of cards of nature.